The first thing my father said after the lawyer finished reading the will was, "Now you finally understand your place." I can still hear the clink of ice in his glass when he said it. We were standing in the parlor of my grandfather's mansion, the same room where Navy secretaries, senators, and decorated officers had once shaken Admiral Thomas Whitaker's hand. The late afternoon sun was pouring across the Persian rug, lighting up the polished wood walls and the portraits of long dead men in uniform. My mother stood beside the marble fireplace with her arms folded, already wearing the expression she used whenever she thought she had won. And there I was, still in the navy blue service uniform I had driven home in from Quantico, holding my cover in one hand, like I was some visitor instead of family. Then my mother looked me in the eye and said, "You'll need to pack tonight. This house belongs to us now." My father added almost casually, "Now you're homeless." That was the moment the floor dropped out from under me. Looking back, I suppose the shock shouldn't have hit me that hard. I was 32 years old, a United States Marine captain, and old enough to know that money can bring out the worst in people. But there is something about being cast out of the house where you learn to walk, read, grieve, and hope that makes you feel like a little girl again. I didn't argue then. I couldn't. I just stood there with my grandfather's funeral still fresh in my bones, staring at the faces of the two people who should have protected me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 days earlier, I had stood at Arlington in dress blues and watched them fold the flag. My grandfather, Admiral Thomas Whitaker, was 92 when he passed away, and until the final year of his life he still carried himself like a man in command. He had served in Korea as a young officer, then in Vietnam, and spent the rest of his career rising through the ranks with that old-fashioned discipline men of his generation seemed to wear as naturally as skin. He was not a warm man in public. Most people remembered the crisp voice, the straight back, the way he could silence a room without raising his volume. But at home with me, he was different. He taught me how to tie a square knot before I could ride a bicycle. He taught me how to check the oil in a car, how to shake hands properly, how to look people in the eye when they were speaking. On Saturday mornings, he made pancakes in a cast-iron skillet and let me drown mine in syrup while he drank black coffee and read the paper. When I was 10 and came home crying because some girls at school said I was too serious and too awkward, he sat me down at the breakfast table and said, "Character often looks lonely before it looks admirable." That line stayed with me. My parents, on the other hand, moved through life like permanent guests waiting for service. My father had worked in real estate years ago with mixed results and liked to talk about big opportunities that never seemed to pan out. My mother belonged to charity boards, mostly for the luncheons and photographs. They liked the Admiral's name, his status, the invitations that came with being his son and daughter-in-law, but they didn't like the discipline that came with him or the moral expectations. When I was young, they left me at the mansion for weeks at a time under the excuse that Granddad enjoyed the company. The truth was, he raised me more than they ever did. That was why I joined the Marines. People assume daughters follow in family military tradition out of obligation. For me, it was simpler. Service was the only honest language I had ever seen. My grandfather never once pushed me toward uniform. In fact, when I told him I wanted to apply to officer candidate school, he just nodded and asked, "Do you want it enough to suffer for it?" When I said yes, he replied, "Then earn it." I did. By the time he died, I had 2 deployments behind me, and a body that woke up stiff on cold mornings. I had missed birthdays, Christmases, and more ordinary Tuesdays than I could count. But Granddad understood that life. He never complained about my absences. He would simply write short letters in his neat hand, always ending with the same line, "Stand steady." When his health failed for good that winter, I took leave and came home to Virginia. The mansion sat on the water outside Norfolk, old brick and white columns, the sort of place people slowed down to admire from the road. Inside, it smelled like lemon polish, old books, and salt air drifting in from the bay. Even in hospice care, Granddad insisted on being wheeled to the library in the afternoons. That room was his true kingdom. Naval histories, framed maps, ship models, and windows looking out over the gray-blue water. 2 days before he died, he asked me to sit with him there. "You came back," he said. Of course I did. He studied me a long moment. His face had gone thin, but his eyes were still sharp. People show themselves clearly when the anchor line snaps. I smiled a little, not understanding. That sounds like one of your lessons. It is. He rested his hand over mine. Read everything carefully, Amelia. Especially when grief is making everyone else careless. Those were nearly the last coherent words he ever said to me. At the funeral, my parents cried in public, accepted condolences, and played their roles well. My father stood with a heroic expression that didn't belong to him. My mother wore black silk and grief like matching accessories. People approached me, old officers and their wives, neighbors, even one retired Marine colonel who had known Granddad in Washington. They all said the same kind of thing. Your grandfather was proud of you. He talked about you constantly. He said you had the strongest spine in the family. I was grateful for that, but exhausted too. Grief is a heavy thing at any age. It settles behind the ribs and turns simple tasks into labor. The will reading took place the next afternoon at a law office in downtown Norfolk. It was a quiet, old-fashioned place with paneled walls, brass lamps, and framed certificates yellowed with age. The attorney, Mr. Callahan, had handled my grandfather's affairs for years. He was in his 70s, silver-haired, careful, and not prone to dramatics. He offered coffee none of us touched, opened the file, and began. My parents received the mansion. They received the Tesla. They received substantial investment accounts and art holdings. I heard the numbers, but they floated past me strangely as if I were underwater. When he came to my name, there was a pause. Then a short provision so brief it barely sounded real. A personal bequest, some letters, a Navy shadow box, my grandfather's watch. That was all. My mother exhaled softly, pleased. My father leaned back in his chair like a man whose luck had finally come in. I felt heat rise into my face, not anger yet, but disbelief. Not because I wanted his money. I hadn't spent my adult life depending on family wealth, but because I knew him the way people know weather in their bones. My grandfather would never have confused inheritance with love, but he also would never have left me exposed to my parents' mercy. When we stepped out onto the sidewalk afterward, my father jingled the Tesla keycard in his hand and said, "Well, Amelia, I guess the old man surprised us all." He was smiling when he said it. And by sundown, I was standing in the mansion parlor hearing the words that would split my life clean in two. Now you're homeless. The strange thing about shock is how quiet it feels. When my father said the words, "Now you're homeless," I expected anger to rise in me immediately, some kind of sharp, righteous protest. But nothing like that happened. Instead, everything inside me went oddly still, the way the air does before a storm rolls in off the Atlantic. I stood there in the parlor, holding my Marine cover in my hands, staring at the two people who had raised me, or at least had been present during my childhood. "You can't be serious," I said finally. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. My mother gave a small, impatient sigh, as if I were a teenager refusing to accept a simple rule. "Amelia, don't make this dramatic," she said. "Your father and I need privacy. This house is ours now." I looked around the room slowly. The Admiral's portrait hung above the mantel, his uniform immaculate rows of ribbons across his chest. The same portrait had been there my whole life. I had grown up beneath that steady gaze. For a moment, I almost expected the old man to walk in from the hallway and put an end to this nonsense. But the house felt different now. Quieter. Colder. My father crossed the room and picked up a crystal glass from the side table. He poured himself bourbon from the decanter Granddad had kept there for decades. "You've got a good job," he said casually. "You're a Marine officer. You'll figure it out." He swirled the ice. "Frankly," he added, "you should have your own place by now anyway." Something about the way he said it, like I was an inconvenience that had finally been cleared away, made my stomach tighten. "I just buried my grandfather this morning," I said. Neither of them answered. My mother glanced at the large grandfather clock near the staircase. "If you could pack tonight," she said, "that would make things easier for everyone." That was when the anger finally arrived. Not loud. Not explosive. Just a slow burn rising behind my ribs. "This is my home too," I said. My father shrugged.
Was.
He took a sip of bourbon. "You heard the lawyer." I remembered something my grandfather once told me when I was about 12. We had been standing on the dock behind the house watching Navy ships moving slowly across the bay. "People reveal themselves during 3 moments," he said. "War, money, and inheritance." I didn't fully understand what he meant back then. Now I did. My duffel bag was still upstairs in the bedroom I had slept in since childhood. I went up slowly, each step on the staircase creaking under my weight. The hallway looked exactly the same. Family photos lined the walls. My high school graduation picture. A photo of Granddad and me standing beside a destroyer when I was 13. Another of him pinning my first set of Marine officer bars onto my collar. I paused there longer than I meant to. That had been one of the proudest moments of my life. And his. When I reached my room, the window was still open slightly, letting in the cool salt air from the bay. The bed was neatly made. My suitcase sat where I had left it after the funeral. For a moment I just stood there. I had spent nearly 20 years of my life in this room. Studying for exams. Writing letters to my grandfather during officer training. Packing before deployments. Coming home exhausted and sunburned after months overseas. And now I was being told I didn't belong here. I sat down on the edge of the bed and rubbed my face. It wasn't the loss of the mansion that hurt. Honestly, I didn't care about the house or the Tesla or any of the money. What hurt was the speed of the betrayal. Less than 24 hours after Granddad's funeral, my parents were already celebrating their inheritance and erasing me from the picture. That kind of coldness doesn't appear overnight. It had probably been waiting for years. I packed slowly. Uniforms first. Then civilian clothes. Then a few books. In the desk drawer I found something I hadn't seen in years. A small brass compass. Granddad had given it to me when I left for officer training. The engraving on the back read, "Stand steady." I closed my hand around it. For a moment I thought about marching back downstairs and telling my parents exactly what I thought of them. But Marines are trained to control their reactions. Emotion rarely improves a situation. So I zipped my bag and carried it downstairs. My parents were sitting in the kitchen when I came in. My father had moved on to a second drink. My mother was scrolling through her phone. "Done already?" she asked. "Yes." "Good." My father stood up and walked to the back door. "I'll help you with the bags." For a brief second I thought he meant something kind. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. "Bring them," he said. I followed him onto the driveway. The evening air smelled like salt and wet grass. The sun was dropping low over the water behind the house. My car was parked near the garage. Before I could put my bag inside, my father took it from my hands and tossed it onto the pavement beside the curb. The second bag followed. Then he walked back toward the house. "That should do it," he said. My mother appeared in the doorway. "Oh," she added casually, "we're changing the security codes tonight." And then they shut the door. Just like that. I stood on the curb for a long time. Neighbors' porch lights flickered on across the street. A boat horn sounded faintly out on the bay. I looked up at the house. The place where I had learned to ride a bike in the driveway. Where Granddad had taught me discipline and patience. Where Saturday mornings smelled like pancakes and coffee. Now it felt like someone else's property. I picked up my bags and loaded them into the trunk of my car. For the first time in years, I had no idea where I was going to sleep. As I got into the driver's seat, something Granddad had said a few days before he died came drifting back into my mind. His voice had been weak but steady. "Read everything carefully, Amelia." At the time I thought he meant life in general. Now I wasn't so sure. 2 days later my phone rang. It was the lawyer. And the first thing he said was, "Captain Whitaker, did your parents read the entire will?" The call came early on a gray Tuesday morning while I was sitting in a diner outside Quantico. It was the kind of place that had been there forever. Vinyl booths, coffee that never quite stopped flowing, and a waitress who called everyone Han. I had driven back toward base after leaving Norfolk 2 days earlier. I spent the first night in a modest roadside motel, and the second in the spare room of a retired Marine friend who didn't ask too many questions. But that morning I needed coffee, real coffee, the kind that sits heavy in the stomach and gives you time to think. The diner windows looked out over a stretch of wet highway and a row of bare winter trees. A few older men sat at the counter discussing fishing conditions on the Potomac. One of them wore a Korean War veteran cap. I remember noticing that detail for some reason. I had just finished my second cup when my phone buzzed on the table. The screen showed Callahan and Burke Law Offices, Norfolk, Virginia. For a moment I simply stared at it. Mr. Callahan was not the kind of lawyer who called people casually. I answered. Captain Whitaker speaking. There was a small pause on the other end. Good morning, Amelia, came the familiar voice of Mr. Harold Callahan. He sounded calm, but there was something unusual in his tone, almost amused. Yes, sir, I said. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. No, sir. Well, he said slowly, I wanted to ask you something rather specific. I waited. Did your parents read the entire will? The question caught me completely off guard. I assumed they did, I said. Mr. Callahan let out a short breath that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. Well, that explains quite a bit. Now I sat up straighter in the booth. I'm not sure I follow you, I said. Tell me something, he continued. After the reading, did anything unusual happen? That was one way to describe it. They kicked me out of the house, I said simply. There was silence for a moment. Then Mr. Callahan laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, but the kind of restrained laugh an experienced man lets out when a puzzle piece suddenly clicks into place. Well, he said at last, that answers my question. What question? Whether they bothered to turn the page. I frowned. Turn the page. Yes, he replied. The Admiral's will is a rather detailed document. I felt something shift inside my chest. Mr. Callahan, I said carefully, are you telling me there's more to it? Oh, there's quite a bit more to it. The waitress walked by and topped off my coffee without asking. I barely noticed. What exactly does that mean, I asked. Mr. Callahan spoke slowly now, choosing his words with care. It means he said that the section we read the other day was only the first part of the inheritance structure. I leaned forward in the booth. You're serious? Quite. A cold memory drifted through my mind. Then my grandfather sitting in his library just days before he passed away. His thin hand resting over mine. Read everything carefully, Amelia. I felt a small chill move down my spine. What happens if someone doesn't read the whole document, I asked. Well, Mr. Callahan said mildly, that depends entirely on their behavior. That sentence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. What behavior? I think he said it would be best if you came to the office so we can discuss this properly. I looked at the rain streaking across the diner window. It would take about 3 hours to drive back to Norfolk. When I asked, how soon can you get here? I'll leave now. Good, he replied. There was a small pause before he added something else. Amelia, your grandfather was a very deliberate man. Yes, sir. And he had a remarkable understanding of human nature. That I already knew. I believe Mr. Callahan continued he expected certain people to behave exactly the way they did. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. What are you saying? I'm saying, he replied calmly, that the Admiral rarely left things to chance. Then he added one final sentence. You might want to hear the rest of that, Will. The drive to Norfolk felt longer than usual. The weather had turned cold and damp, the sky a dull blanket of gray stretching over the highway. Traffic moved steadily but slowly along I-95. Tractor trailers hummed past like moving walls. For most of the drive, I kept replaying Mr. Callahan's words in my mind. Whether they bothered to turn the page. That phrase stuck with me. My parents had always been impatient people. They liked the beginning of things, big announcements, flashy outcomes, easy rewards, but they never had much patience for details. Granddad, on the other hand, had lived in the details. Every decision he made had layers beneath it. When I finally reached downtown Norfolk, the streets were damp from rain, and the harbor wind carried the faint smell of salt and diesel fuel. Navy ships sat anchored in the distance like silent steel giants. Mr. Callahan's office looked exactly the same as it had 2 days earlier. Polished wood, framed legal certificates, a brass lamp glowing warmly over the conference table. He stood when I entered. Captain Whitaker, he said with a small nod. Sir. I sat down across from him. For a moment he studied me carefully. I'm sorry about your grandfather, he said sincerely. Thank you. Then he opened the thick folder sitting on the desk between us. This, he said, tapping the stack of papers, is Admiral Whitaker's full will and estate directive. He turned several pages slowly. The quiet rustle of paper filled the room. I must admit, he continued, I suspected something might happen. You did. Well, he said thoughtfully, the Admiral specifically instructed me to wait 48 hours before contacting you, if certain conditions were met. My heart skipped slightly. What conditions? Mr. Callahan adjusted his glasses. The condition, he said, that your parents violated the will. The room suddenly felt very still. What do you mean? He slid a page toward me. At the top was a section labeled Conditional Inheritance Clause. Mr. Callahan folded his hands. You see, Amelia, he said quietly, your parents did inherit the mansion. Yes. But only under very specific conditions. I looked down at the document. My grandfather's signature sat at the bottom of the page in firm, steady ink. Mr. Callahan smiled faintly, and from what you told me on the phone, he tapped the paper gently. They broke those conditions within 24 hours. My chest tightened. What happens when that happens? Mr. Callahan leaned back in his chair. Well, he said calmly, that's where things get interesting. Mr. Callahan slid the document across the polished desk toward me. The paper itself didn't look extraordinary, just legal language, dense paragraphs, numbered clauses, the kind of writing most people skim because they assume the important part has already been said. My parents had clearly done exactly that. I read the heading again. Conditional Inheritance Clause. For a moment I didn't speak. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock somewhere behind me. Take your time, Mr. Callahan said. I began reading. The first lines explained that the Admiral's primary residence, the Norfolk waterfront estate, along with certain vehicles and assets, would initially pass to my parents. That much I already knew. But the next section stopped me cold. The inheritance, it stated, was conditional. My parents were required to uphold 3 specific obligations. The first condition read, the beneficiaries must allow Captain Amelia Whitaker permanent residence within the family home for as long as she wishes. I blinked and looked up. Mr. Callahan gave a small nod. Keep reading, he said. The second condition followed immediately. Captain Amelia Whitaker shall maintain shared authority regarding the management and preservation of the estate property. Shared authority. Not guest. Not visitor. Authority. I felt my heartbeat begin to rise. Then I read the third condition. The beneficiaries must maintain and support the Admiral Thomas Whitaker Veterans Outreach Foundation, as outlined in the estate directive. That foundation had been my grandfather's passion in the last years of his life. He had spent enormous energy helping aging veterans find housing, medical care, and community. My parents had always treated the project like a nuisance. I looked back at the page. There was one more section beneath those conditions. The final paragraph. The enforcement clause. If any of the above conditions are violated or deliberately ignored by the beneficiaries, full ownership of the Norfolk estate and associated assets shall immediately transfer to Captain Amelia Whitaker. I stopped reading. For several seconds I simply stared at the words. Then I looked up slowly. Mr. Callahan was watching me carefully. You see the problem, he said gently. My parents kicked me out. Yes. They changed the security codes. Yes. And they told me I wasn't family anymore. Mr. Callahan folded his hands on the desk. Legally speaking, he said calmly, they violated the will within 24 hours. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb the reality of what I had just read. My grandfather had known. He had predicted exactly what would happen. A strange mixture of emotions rolled through me then. Surprise. Vindication. Sadness. Because none of this felt like revenge. Not really. It felt more like a lesson my grandfather had carefully constructed. He knew, I murmured. Mr. Callahan tilted his head slightly. Yes. How? The older lawyer smiled faintly. Amelia, I worked with your grandfather for almost 30 years. He leaned back in his chair. Admiral Whitaker understood people better than most judges I've met. I thought back to the last conversation I had with Granddad in his library. People show themselves when the anchor line snaps. He hadn't just been speaking metaphorically. He had been preparing the trap. What happens now, I asked. Mr. Callahan opened another folder. Technically, the moment your parents expelled you from the property, the conditional clause activated. So the house is legally yours. The sentence hung in the air. Even hearing it spoken out loud felt surreal. That includes the Tesla, he added, and the investment holdings tied to the estate. I let out a slow breath. I don't care about the Tesla. Mr. Callahan chuckled softly. Your grandfather suspected that. He pushed another document toward me. This is the transfer certification. I scanned the page. Legal language. Property ownership documentation. Official notarized forms. Everything was already prepared. You expected this, I said. I suspected it, he corrected. And your grandfather instructed me to prepare the paperwork in advance, just in case. I rubbed my forehead. It was still difficult to process. What about my parents? Mr. Callahan's voice remained steady. They will be formally notified once the transfer is finalized. How long will that take? A few days. And then, he gave a small shrug. Then, the legal owner of the property may decide who is permitted to live there. The meaning was obvious. The same power my parents had used against me now sat quietly in my hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since I started reading the document. Did my grandfather leave any explanation? Mr. Callahan smiled. Actually, yes. He opened the folder again and removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in the careful handwriting I knew so well. Amelia. My throat tightened slightly. He asked that you read it privately, Mr. Callahan said. I held the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter was written in the same neat block handwriting he used for everything. Amelia. If you're reading this, then events likely unfolded the way I suspected they would. Do not be angry. People reveal their character when comfort replaces discipline. I swallowed. Your parents were never cruel people by nature, but they became careless with responsibility. This arrangement was not designed to punish them. It was designed to show you who you can trust when the tide turns. My vision blurred slightly as I read the next line. You have always had the strongest compass in this family. Stand steady. I lowered the letter slowly. The room felt very quiet. Mr. Callahan studied my expression but didn't interrupt. Finally, I looked up. So the house is mine. Yes. And my parents don't know yet? Not yet. A strange calm settled over me then. The kind of calm that comes before a major decision. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Mr. Callahan. Yes. I think it's time we paid my parents a visit. The lawyer smiled slightly. I was hoping you'd say that. Outside, the wind coming off the harbor had picked up. Storm clouds were gathering over the bay. And for the first time since my grandfather's funeral, I felt like the tide might be turning. 3 days later, I drove back to the mansion. The weather had cleared overnight, and the Virginia sky stretched wide and pale blue above the Chesapeake Bay. The same road I had driven down 100 times growing up looked almost unfamiliar now. Houses lined the quiet waterfront street, their docks reaching out toward the gray-green water like long wooden fingers. My car rolled slowly toward the end of the road. Toward the house. For a moment I considered how strange it felt to return to a place that was legally mine but emotionally uncertain. A week earlier, I had been pushed out like a stranger. Now I was the one holding the papers. Beside me in the passenger seat sat a leather folder containing several official documents stamped with county seals and signatures. Ownership transfer. Estate activation. Legal certification. Mr. Callahan had insisted everything be done properly. Justice works best, he told me that morning in his office, when it arrives quietly and clearly. I appreciated that. There was nothing loud or theatrical about what was about to happen. It was simply the truth catching up with people. When I pulled into the long driveway, the first thing I noticed was the Tesla parked near the front entrance. My father had moved it there like a trophy. The mansion itself looked the same as always, white columns, wide porch, tall windows catching the afternoon light. But something felt different now. Maybe it was the knowledge of what my grandfather had quietly arranged behind the scenes. Or maybe it was the calm that comes when you know exactly where you stand. I parked and stepped out of the car. The wind carried the familiar smell of salt water across the lawn. For a moment I stood still looking at the house where I had spent most of my life. Granddad used to say buildings remember things. If that was true, these walls had witnessed a lot of history. Birthday dinners, arguments, laughter, and now this. As I walked up the front steps, I could hear voices inside. More than two. My parents were entertaining. That didn't surprise me. My mother had never been able to resist a social gathering, especially one where she could display success. Through the large front window, I saw several figures moving inside the dining room. Crystal glasses reflected light from the chandelier. Someone laughed loudly. I knocked. A moment later, the door opened. My mother stood there in a pale blue dress, her hair perfectly styled, a glass of white wine in her hand. When she saw me, her smile vanished. "What are you doing here?" I met her eyes calmly. "I came home." Her expression hardened. "I told you." "Yes," I said gently, "you did." Behind her, several guests had noticed the conversation and turned to look. I recognized two of them neighbors from down the street and one of my father's old golf friends. My father appeared in the hallway behind my mother. His face tightened when he saw me. "Amelia," he said sharply, "this isn't the time." "Actually," I replied, "it's exactly the time." I stepped inside without waiting for permission. The room fell quiet. My father walked forward, lowering his voice. "You need to leave. Before we do this in front of everyone." I opened the leather folder slowly. "I don't think that's necessary." My father glanced down at the documents in my hands. "What is that?" "Paperwork." My mother crossed her arms. "We already handled the will." "Yes," I said. "You handled the first page." That caught their attention. My father frowned. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the top document from the folder and handed it to him. He took it reluctantly. "What is this?" "Ownership transfer." The words in the room suddenly seemed heavier. He scanned the page quickly. Then again. The color drained from his face. "That's impossible." My mother leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" Her eyes moved across the document. Then she looked at me sharply. "What kind of trick is this?" "No trick," I said calmly. "Just the rest of the will." My father's voice grew tight. "That house belongs to us. Not anymore." My mother shook her head. "You can't just walk in here with fake papers." "They're certified," I said. "Filed with the county 2 days ago." My father looked at the document again. His hands were beginning to tremble slightly. "That lawyer wouldn't—" "He did." I pulled another page from the folder. "The conditional inheritance clause." My father read the heading out loud. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Conditional inheritance?" Behind us, the dinner guests had gone completely silent. One of the neighbors cleared his throat awkwardly. My mother snatched the paper from my father's hand. Her eyes moved quickly across the text. I watched the moment it hit her. The exact second she understood. Her face went pale. "That can't be right," she said quietly. "But it is." My father looked up at me slowly. "You're saying—" "Yes. The moment you threw me out of the house, I said you violated the will." Silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint ticking of the hallway clock. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. "You're serious?" "I always am." He looked around the dining room as if trying to find some explanation in the faces of his friends. There wasn't one. Finally, he spoke again. "So what now?" The question hung in the air. A week earlier, he had asked the same thing when he tossed my bags onto the driveway. Only now the positions were reversed. I could have said a lot of things. I could have repeated his words. "Now you're homeless." But my grandfather's voice echoed quietly in my mind. "Stand steady." So instead, I said something else. "I'll decide that soon." And for the first time since the will had been read, my father looked genuinely afraid. After the dinner guests left, the house became very quiet. That kind of quiet has weight to it. It settles into corners, hangs over tables, presses against the walls. A few minutes earlier, the dining room had been full of forced laughter, clinking glasses, and the low murmur of people pretending not to witness a family collapse in real time. Now there was only the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, and the distant sound of water moving against the pilings down by the dock. My father stood near the sideboard with one hand braced against the polished wood. My mother remained at the dining table, still holding the conditional inheritance clause, as if reading it enough times might change the words. Neither of them looked at me. I stood at the end of the table with the leather folder tucked under my arm, and a strange mix of strength and sadness moving through me. This was the moment I had imagined on the drive over, the moment when truth landed squarely in front of them. I thought it would feel triumphant. It didn't. It felt heavy. My mother finally broke the silence. "He set us up," she said quietly. I looked at her. "No," I replied. "He told you who you needed to be. You made your own choices." She lifted her head sharply, but she had no answer for that. My father cleared his throat. "Amelia, maybe we should all sit down and talk about this." There was a time in my life when I would have jumped at that sentence, when I would have mistaken delayed decency for genuine remorse. But age, service, and disappointment teach a person to hear what is actually being said. He didn't want reconciliation. He wanted damage control. So I said, "You had your chance to talk when you put my bags on the curb." That landed. He looked down at the table. For a while, nobody spoke. Then I turned and walked out of the dining room through the front hall and toward the library. The moment I stepped inside, I felt my throat tighten. The room smelled exactly the way it always had: old leather-polished wood paper and the faint trace of pipe tobacco that had lingered in the bookshelves for years, even though Granddad had quit long ago. The green-shaded lamp still sat on the side table beside his chair. A pair of reading glasses rested on a closed biography of Chester Nimitz. Out the tall windows, the bay stretched into the darkening distance, silver blue under the last of the evening light. This was the room where my grandfather had spent the final years of his life, the room where he had taught me about duty, discipline, and not confusing sentiment with weakness. He used to say that a person should have one room in the world where truth was allowed to sit undisturbed. For him, it had been this one. I crossed to his desk and rested my fingers lightly on the worn edge of the wood. Every drawer had its purpose. Every object had its place. He was orderly to the point of ritual. As a child, I had teased him about it. He always answered the same way. Order keeps you honest when emotion tries to take command. At the center of the desk sat a small wooden box I didn't remember seeing before. It was made of dark walnut, smooth and plain except for a brass clasp. On top of it lay an envelope with my name written in his hand. "Amelia?" I stared at it for a moment before sitting down in his chair. My fingers were steadier than I expected as I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter several pages long. I unfolded the first sheet and began to read. "Amelia, if this letter is in your hands, then you have already seen enough to know that I expected trouble after my death. I take no pleasure in that, but age grants a man certain clarity. I have had many decades to observe the strengths and weaknesses of our family. Love does not require blindness, and loyalty does not excuse cowardice." I paused, already hearing his voice in the words. "Your parents were not born selfish. Very few people are. Selfishness usually grows slowly, watered by comfort, resentment, vanity, and the habit of believing someone else will always pay the cost. I watched that happen to them over the years. I tried sometimes too gently to correct it. In the end, I chose a different method." I swallowed and kept reading. The will was never written to humiliate them. It was written to reveal them. If they welcomed you, cared for this house responsibly, and supported the Veterans Foundation, then they would have proven themselves worthy of the inheritance. If they cast you out, then they would prove the opposite. I let the page lower slightly. "Reveal them." That was exactly what he had done. I read on. "Now I must tell you something more important. If the estate has passed to you because of their failure, then you will face your own test. It is a more difficult one. Power often arrives wearing the mask of justice. It whispers that because you have been wronged, you are entitled to wound in return. Do not listen too quickly." I leaned back in the chair. Outside, a gull cried somewhere over the water. "You have every right to remove them from this house if you believe it necessary. But before you act, ask yourself one question. What course leaves your character intact? Revenge can satisfy a hurt feeling for a moment. Character is what keeps a person company for the rest of her life." That line hit me harder than anything else. Because until that moment, part of me had wanted them to feel exactly what they had made me feel. The humiliation, the helplessness, the cold shock of realizing there was no soft place to land. I wanted them to stand on the curb looking back at the only home that had ever mattered to them. And my grandfather knew that. Of course he knew. I turned to the final page. The true inheritance I leave you is not the house, nor the motor car, nor any sum of money. It is the opportunity to choose differently than those who came before you. If you can do justice without cruelty, hold boundaries without hatred, and preserve your dignity without surrendering your compassion, then you will have understood everything I ever tried to teach you. Take care of the Veterans Foundation. Take care of the house if you keep it. And if your parents one day find the honesty to repent, leave the door open just wide enough for them to walk through it themselves. Stand steady. Granddad. For a long time I sat there with the letter in my hands. The room had gone dim around me. The last light was fading from the windows, and the outlines of the ship models on the shelves had softened into shadow. I felt tears coming then, not hot tears of anger, but the quieter kind that come when love and grief show up together. He was still teaching me. Even now. A soft knock sounded at the library door. I looked up. It was Mr. Callahan. I had almost forgotten he was still in the house speaking with my parents in the front hall after the guests left. He stepped in, carefully closed the door behind him, and took one look at my face. I take it he left you a letter? I nodded. He left me a final exam, I said. That made him smile. Yes, he said, that sounds like the Admiral. I folded the pages carefully and placed them back in the envelope. I could put them out tonight, I said quietly. Mr. Callahan didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, looked out toward the bay, then turned back to me. Yes, he said, you could. But that's not what he wants. No, he said, I don't believe it is. I let out a long breath and stood. Then I know what I'm going to do. Mr. Callahan studied me for a moment, then gave a slow nod. And what is that? I looked down at the letter once more before answering. I'm going to give them consequences, I said, without becoming cruel. And for the first time since the funeral, that felt like solid ground under my feet. The next morning the house felt different. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows facing the bay, turning the water outside into a sheet of pale gold. For a moment I stood in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee, watching the slow movement of boats in the distance. The same view my grandfather had watched for decades. It was quiet, peaceful, but not empty. For the first time since his funeral, I felt like I could breathe again. Behind me I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. My father entered the kitchen slowly. He looked older than he had the night before. The confidence that had always carried him through rooms, through deals, conversations, and social gatherings had drained away. He cleared his throat. You're up early. Habit, I said. He nodded awkwardly. Military schedules have a way of following you long after the alarm stops ringing. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then he said something that surprised me. I didn't sleep much. I turned to face him. I'm not surprised. He ran a hand through his hair, looking around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. You really own the house now? Yes. The word landed between us with a quiet finality. He leaned against the counter. I suppose you could tell us to leave. I could. Another silence followed. Then my mother appeared in the doorway. Her makeup was gone, her hair pulled back simply, and the sharp confidence she had worn during the dinner party had softened into something closer to uncertainty. Amelia, she said carefully. I waited. We owe you an apology. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No tears. No speeches. Just a simple sentence spoken in a quiet kitchen. But after everything that had happened, it mattered. My father nodded slowly. We handled things badly, he said. Very badly. I studied them both. For years I had wanted to hear those words, but now that they had arrived, I realized something important. An apology does not erase what happened. It simply opens a door. Whether you walk through it is another matter. I read Granddad's letter last night, I said. My mother looked up. He left you one. Yes? What did it say? I thought about the pages folded in my pocket. He said something interesting, I replied. I stepped closer to the kitchen table and set my coffee down. He said money doesn't change people. They watched me quietly. It just removes the mask. My father looked down. I guess we proved that. Yes, I said. But the story doesn't have to end there. That caught their attention. My mother frowned slightly. What do you mean? I pulled 3 papers from the folder Mr. Callahan had prepared. The first was the official estate transfer. The second was the charter for the Admiral Thomas Whitaker Veterans Outreach Foundation. The third was a simple agreement. I laid them on the table. "The mansion stays in my name," I said calmly. "That's not changing." They nodded. "I expected that." "But you won't be thrown out," I continued. Both of them looked up quickly. "You can stay here," I said. "Under conditions." My father gave a tired smile. "Seems fair." I pointed to the foundation document. "The Veterans Outreach Program is expanding. Granddad left enough funding to build transitional housing for older veterans who don't have families." My mother looked surprised. "I didn't know that." "You never asked." That line stung, but it was true. I continued. "The guest cottages on the east side of the property are being converted into housing for veterans and their spouses." My father studied the plan. "That's actually a good idea." "It was his idea," I said. "You two can stay in the smaller cottage near the garden." My mother blinked. "You're moving us out of the house." "I'm repurposing the house. The main building would become the headquarters for the foundation. Meeting rooms, counseling offices, community spaces for veterans who had spent decades serving the country, but now needed somewhere steady to land." My father leaned back slowly. "So the Admiral's mansion becomes a veterans center?" "Yes." He let out a small breath. "You know, he would have liked that." I smiled slightly. "I know." For a while, the three of us sat quietly around the table. Finally, my mother spoke again. "You're being more generous than we deserve." Maybe that was true. But I remembered something my grandfather once said while we were repairing an old dock railing together. "Strength," he told me, "is the ability to choose restraint when you have the power not to." Revenge would have been easy. Cruelty would have been simple. But neither of those things would have honored the man who raised me. Months passed. The foundation work began quickly. Volunteers arrived. Construction crews converted the guest cottages into comfortable housing. Veterans started coming in small numbers, at first retired sailors, former Marines' widows of servicemen who had nowhere else to go. Many of them were older. Men and women who had spent decades serving the country only to discover retirement could sometimes be lonely. The mansion slowly transformed. The dining room became a meeting hall. The library remained exactly as my grandfather left it. His portrait still hung above the fireplace. And every time I walked past it, I felt like he was quietly approving of the course we had chosen. My parents adjusted too. It wasn't easy for them at first. Pride rarely fades overnight. But something changed when they began meeting the veterans who came through the property. My father started helping maintain the docks. My mother began organizing community dinners twice a week. One afternoon, nearly 6 months later, my father joined me on the porch overlooking the water. He leaned on the railing beside me. "I've been thinking about your grandfather," he said. "I do that a lot. He was a complicated man." "Yes." My father nodded slowly. "But he was right about something." "What's that?" He looked out at the bay where a Navy destroyer moved slowly toward open water. "Character matters more than money." I smiled a little. That was one of his favorite lessons. He looked back at the house behind us, the old Admiral's mansion now filled with conversation, movement, and purpose. "You turned his plan into something bigger," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "He did." The sun dipped lower over the Chesapeake, turning the water into a sheet of copper and light. For a moment I imagined my grandfather standing beside us the way he used to, hands clasped behind his back, studying the horizon. And I realized something. The greatest inheritance he left wasn't the house. It wasn't the Tesla. It wasn't the money. It was the chance to choose who I would become when the world tested me. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone who shaped your life the way my grandfather shaped mine, then I hope you'll take a moment today to remember them. Maybe even share their story with someone who needs to hear it. Because the people who teach us character deserve to be remembered long after the inheritance papers are signed. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about family dignity and the choices that define us, you're always welcome to stay a while and listen. Thank you for being here.